The Bible devotes pages upon pages to describing moral codes, which the faithful believe to be divinely revealed ethical systems, as well as stories with deep moral lessons to them. The Church, in passing on and interpreting the Bible, eventually developed a very precise and systematically well-defined moral system. For the faithful, the teachings of Scripture, tradition, and the Church constitute a large part of the standard that they use to determine right from wrong. Yet, what happens if one finds oneself in a morally ambiguous situation? That is to say, let's just say you find yourself in a situation where you are unsure of how to act, in that neither Scripture nor the Church make any explicit or direct statements about the best way to act, or where there is large amount of disagreement among theologians about the best way to act. How are you to make a choice in these situations? This was actually something that was hotly debated in the early modern era. Several distinct schools of thought originated that attempted to deal with such situations. One school of thought was known as laxism. This school of thought states that if you find yourself in a morally ambiguous situation, that is, a situation where neither the Bible nor the Church make a definitive statement on what is considered right and wrong, it is okay to follow the less morally safe option if it does not contradict anything that the Bible does say or imply, and if one does so with a good conscience, that is, with no intention of sinning. That is to say, if you find yourself in a morally ambiguous situation, it is morally permissible for you to act in accordance with the less safe moral option if it doesn't contradict anything that is either explicitly said or implied by Scripture or the Church, and if one acts with no intention to sin. You see, the laxists believed that God knows that you are in a morally difficult situation, and the proper or the most morally upright way to act was not clearly evident to you. Yet God will have mercy on you if nothing you did directly contradicted what God has commanded or prohibited, and if the reason why you acted the way you did was because you thought that that was the best or most morally acceptable way to act. Laxism was first proposed in the late 16th century by the Spanish priest and theologian Father Bartholomew Medina. Laxism was condemned as a heresy in 1679 by Pope Innocent XI. About a decade earlier, in the 1660s, Pope Alexander VII condemned not laxism as such, but certain specific ideas connected to laxism. Around the same time laxism emerged, another school of thought emerged known as rigorism, which stated that in these morally ambiguous situations, one is obliged all the time, no matter what, to go with the morally safer line of action. Some forms of rigorism even went as far as stating that we must strictly adhere to the moral law no matter what, and can only deviate from the moral law if we knew with absolute certainty that the opposite of what the moral law said was acceptable. So let me break it down. If you find yourself in a morally ambiguous situation, the rigorists taught that you should always act in accordance with the more morally safe option, unless you knew with as much certainty as a person can have that something other than the morally safe option was morally acceptable. Rigorism was first developed by the Belgian-born theologian and bishop Cornelius Jensen. Jensen was eventually condemned as a heretic by the Catholic Church, and with him rigorism as well. Yet over time, a more moderate form of rigorism developed, which was eventually deemed more acceptable by many theologians within the church. You also saw a lot of schools of thought that attempted to create a middle ground between rigorism and laxism. One such school of thought was known as probabiliarism. Probabiliarism states that the less morally safe option is allowable if it is more morally probable than the safer option. That is to say, if there is an equal or greater probability of the less morally safe option being the morally right way to act compared to the more morally safe option. On the other hand was a school of thought known as equiprobabiliarism. Equiprobabiliarism made a distinction between two sets of moral situations. The first was us trying to figure out if something is a moral responsibility. That is, should we or must we do something? The other was knowing whether or not it is morally permissible to deviate from the moral law, to not do something that we should do, or to do something that we're not sure if it's condemned. When trying to determine whether or not you are obliged to act a certain way, the less morally safe option is permissible if the probability of it being morally acceptable is equal to or close to equal to that of the more morally safe option. That was seen as the minimum level of moral certainty that we could have. Yet, when attempting to determine whether or not something that deviates from the moral law is acceptable, the probability of the less morally safe option being correct must be greater than that of the more morally safe situation. You see, the equiprobabiliarists believed that there was a big difference between failing to live up to our responsibilities and then doing something we ought not to. Failing to live up to your responsibilities was less severe than doing something you ought not to do. So the moral certainty you needed in the latter situation with regard to the less morally safe line of action had to actually be greater than the more morally safe line of action. Yet, when it comes to moral responsibilities, the equiprobabiliarists considered the situation to be less high stakes, and so they believed you didn't need as much moral certainty. That is to say, the level of moral certainty in acting in accordance with the less safe option could be equal to or close to equal to the amount of moral certainty we had, or the probability of the safer option being correct, in order for it to be acceptable. The final common opinion among theologians was probabilism. Now, the name of this school of thought sounds similar to another school of thought that we mentioned earlier, probabiliarism. So you may see the similarity in the name, probabiliarist, probabilist. Yet there was a difference. Whereas the probabiliarists claimed that, in order for the less morally safe option to be morally permissible, the odds of it being morally acceptable had to be equal to or greater than that of the morally safe option. On the other hand, the probabilists simply said that in order for the less morally safe line of action to be permissible, it simply had to be solidly probable. But what does it mean to say that something is solidly probable? The probabilists defined the term solidly probable in rather broad terms. Something is solidly probable if it has a probability of being morally acceptable equal to or greater than the alternative. Yet something can still be solidly probable even if the odds of it being morally acceptable are less than that of the alternative. In this case, it can be seen as morally probable if it can be justified by the theological opinions of certain authorities from tradition. Yet, how many authorities were needed in order to have the minimum amount of moral certainty. Some theologians said you need to be able to cite as many as 5 or 6 different authorities. Others said that only one would suffice, if that theological authority happens to be a saint or a doctor of the church. Of these positions, probabilism was the most widespread. In fact, probabilism spread so rapidly during the late 16th and 17th centuries that one writer, the British-born priest and theologian Father Anthony Terrell, noted that at the time in which he was writing, in the late 17th century, probabilism was accepted by the vast majority of Catholic theologians. St. Alphonsus de Liguori, one of the most popular theologians of that time, also accepted probabilism, which gave it sort of a boost in its reputation. Probabiliarism was the second most common of these theories, and throughout the 17th and 18th century there was a huge debate between the probabiliarists and the probabilists. Now again, all of these theories were meant to answer the question, what do we do if neither the Bible nor the Church have a clear teaching on a particular issue? If the Bible and the Church do have a clear teaching on a particular issue, then the situation is easy. Just do what the Bible and or the Church say. The reason why I talk about this is because this is a very interesting debate. Most of the time, these moral situations are clear-cut. That doesn't mean they're necessarily simple, but there are specific clear-cut answers. Yet, occasionally, you do see morally ambiguous situations pop up. And it's important to have some sort of set of principles to help guide us in these situations. I personally believe that a big reason why a lot of people don't actually know about probabilism, probabiliarism, laxism, rigorism, is because a lot of these theories were developed by various scholastic theologians of the late medieval and early modern era, who were known for debating the minutiae of Catholic theology and getting into the weeds, talking about a lot of highly specific and hyper-technical parts of Catholic theology. So a lot of people find these debates to be unnecessarily confusing and or boring. But I actually think it's important to understand what these theories say, not necessarily because there's a lot of morally ambiguous situations, but because it's good to have a decently sized range of theological principles to use or to draw from, so that you're never in a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to act, I don't know how to make a decision, what are the best set of principles I can use to think through these problems? Again, like they say, it's better to have something and not need it than to need it and not have it. With that in mind, because morally ambiguous situations do come up, I think it's more important to discuss these debates, the debates between the rigorists, the laxists, the probabiliarists, the probabilists, the equiprobabiliarists. It's a lot more important to discuss what these guys have to say, because the fact of the matter is they're not dealing with overly obscure situations. There's a rhetorical question: how many angels can fit on the head of a needle? And this rhetorical question is basically meant to say, what we're discussing is a very obscure issue that has no real-world applications. But the question, how many angels can fit on the head of a needle, is actually a question that some Catholic theologians asked. St. Thomas Aquinas notes that it was a debate in his time as to whether or not multiple angels could inhabit or be present in the same point in space. Angels don't have physical bodies, so the laws that regulate angels don't regulate human bodies. And so as a result, it would be hypothetically possible for more than one angel to occupy the same point in space, whereas that wouldn't necessarily be possible for other physical beings. Later theologians, a few centuries after Aquinas, note that this question had actually evolved into the question, how many angels can fit on the head of a needle? That was actually a question that people were debating. But again, that's a part of the Christian faith that really doesn't affect your relationship with God. Yet, insofar as people are often caught in morally ambiguous situations, it is important to think through the various debates on how humans should think and act in those situations. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to thank you for joining me, and God bless.